So as we've seen, interest groups run a wide range from super institutionalized, large organizations that exert huge policy influence upon their political systems and really fight the good fight when it comes to their issue area, and other interests that are not necessarily represented, that do not institutionalize and organize and exert their political will. And indeed, I would bet that if you thought about a political issue that you care a lot about, some of those political issues are going to be linked to groups that have not really organized. You could think of this as an interest that has not come together, at least not come together effectively to pursue change. Because as we've discussed, when large numbers of the public act collectively, they have immense power. And so solving a lot of problems does have to do with, well, how could we have interest groups that more fairly represent the actual interests of everyday people in society? And so, in other words, what we're trying to understand is, well, why are some interest groups super institutionalized while some are not? Now, of course, this is a form of a collective action problem. We might have strong interests as a group collectively to pursue some course of action to achieve some benefit, to get a different policy that would benefit us. And remember, this can be all sorts of things. This can be based upon your identity in a religion or a racial or ethnic group, a trade organization, an industry, the fact that your students, the place that you live, right, that we're in Colorado, that we're all associated with a college, right? These are all different interests that could be represented by formal institutionalized groups to pursue policies that would be beneficial. And however, there are a lot of times when this does not happen because of collective action problems, because it is easier for us as individuals to free ride. Another wrinkle here, another key source of variation between groups that are super institutionalized, organized, influential, and groups that are not, has to do with their abilities to organize. And groups and interests vary a lot in terms of how easy it is for them to organize. The easiest way to think about this is by looking at incentives, right? We love to look at incentives because that helps us understand how people are going to behave. And when we look at the incentives, we see that certain interests have very concentrated incentives. They have very concentrated, very strong costs and benefits to certain policies, while certain other interests might be much more diffuse, which we mean, by which we mean just simply not any one person is going to feel really large benefits or really large costs. So let's take the example. I don't have a picture of cows here for any random reason. This is an example. This is a dairy farm, a modern dairy farm. And of course, if you are a dairy farmer, you have really concentrated interests in how that industry does, because it's your whole livelihood, it's your family, it's your kids being able to go to school, it's the roof over your head. Now, let's take the instance of farm subsidies, and indeed, a lot of Western governments, including the U.S. federal government, spends a lot of money subsidizing or providing some money to different agricultural sectors, including dairy farmers. And so dairy farmers get some of this public money, and that's really important to them. That's very concentrated. It's often going to be sort of the difference between going out of business and staying in business, that really makes up their livelihood. Now, there is another interest here that is at stake, and that's the interest of everyday consumers like you and me. Now, these farm subsidies might be, might actually be creating perverse incentives in the market, and they might just be inefficient. They might just be sort of wasting our money. They could even be driving up the price of certain things. And so, regardless, this for me individually, maybe a cent or 2 cents of my tax dollars are going to these subsidies. I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but let's say it's small. It couldn't be more than $5. Well, that's what we mean by diffuse. I feel it a little bit, but it's not really enough for me to actually get organized and go out and fight subsidies for, not to pick on any dairy farmers out there in the crowd, right? There are all sorts of industries that are getting favorable policies that are not necessarily beneficial to consumers. They might drive up prices, they might drive down competition, right? All of these sorts of things we could consider sort of not necessarily good use of state resources from our perspective as resources as consumers, but of course, if you feel the very concentrated costs and benefits of this being your industry, well, that matters a lot more. And so we often see interest groups form when individual actors in that group feel very concentrated, very powerful costs or benefits to whatever public policy is at stake. Conversely, where these are very diffuse, where it's, every consumer's losing out on 50 cents a year because of a certain policy, well, because of that diffuse cost and benefit, the total 50 cents each at, over 300 million Americans, well, that adds up to be lots of money. It actually might be bigger than what the industry is reaping. However, because the industry feels those concentrated benefits and costs, they are much more likely to organize, right? They are much more likely to say, this affects us, we need to act collectively. We need to figure out a way to overcome the free rider problem. We need to organize, we need to advocate. And indeed, this is a really big distinction. We often see that producers and consumers have different levels, and usually producers are the companies that are producing stuff are going to organize much more than consumers who are consuming stuff. And again, it's this difference between lots of consumers feeling, very diffuse costs and benefits of a policy, and much fewer producing firms feeling super concentrated costs and benefits of those policies. We also have to take into account sort of the level of support and resources that different groups, different issues, different interests have in society. Certain interests are simply blessed with more resources. So for example, finance and banking firms just have a lot of money, right? And money is important if you are going to organize and institutionalize a group and affect policy. Consumer rights organizations, when it comes to the financial sector, might have to fight a really uphill battle because, again, they are dealing with not only much more diffuse costs and benefits when it comes to people's livelihoods and policies regarding the financial sector, but they are facing off against the financial sector, which has a lot more in terms of hard resources. So in conclusion, what we see is that interests vary in terms of how easy it is to overcome collective action problems and to turn them into interest groups, right? And so interests are not always interest groups, and they have to become interest groups often in order to affect any real policy change in line with their vision and their interests. All right, that's a lot. As always, get in touch if you have any questions, and have a really wonderful day.